Welcome everyone to this panel discussion on performance and feedback. I'm Laura Terrell. It's my pleasure to be with you today. I do work with the NFLC, and I would like to take this opportunity to introduce our panelists. Today we have with us Tim. Tim, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tim Eagan. I'm the 6th to 12th department head in Wellesley Public Schools, which is just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm a longtime member of the board of directors of MAFLA.
Welcome, Tim. Thank you. And Jessica?
Hello, my name is Jessica Kelly. I'm a public high school Spanish and Russian teacher in Lexington, South Carolina.
Welcome, and thank you to you also. Mouna.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mouna. I'm speaking to you all from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I am currently a consultant working on various assessment-related projects, including Avant Assessment's new professional development wing. And very excited to be with you all and talking about learning and performance and moving proficiency forward.
Thank you for joining us, Mouna. And last but not least, Meg.
Hi, everyone. Happy morning, afternoon, or evening. I'm Meg Malone. I'm the director of the Center for Assessment Research and Development at ACTFL, as well as the director of the Assessment and Evaluation Language Resource Center at Georgetown, where I also teach linguistics courses.
So let me just give us a little bit of direction as we get started. As I said earlier, this panel will focus on the TEL domain question for performance and planning. And what we want you to know as audience participants is that you are invited to submit questions in the Q&A chat. That is what we are monitoring. If you see a question appear there that is of interest to you, you can signal and that will move it up. And that way we'll know that that question should be prioritized because we will be taking questions from you. The chat feature is not being monitored for questions. That is simply a back channel for participants to use for their own discussion. And finally, we are limited to this hour, so we're going to do our absolute best to get your questions in. But we're going to start with some of the questions that we feel that the morning sessions you may have attended that address this domain of performance and feedback may have provoked as you were thinking through and reflecting on what you heard already today. So I'm going to start this off by asking a question, the concept of growth mindset. How does that particular question connect to this notion of performance and feedback? And Jessica, I know that you have prepared a session on that, whether people have had the opportunity to watch it yet or not. I would love to hear your thoughts on growth mindset and its connection to performance and feedback.
So when we talk about growth mindsets, we're really talking about how we react and think when we're faced with challenges, whether it's a physical or emotional or psychological reaction, whether or not we're willing to see that as every struggle that we encounter as a learning opportunity that we can really grow from. So when we have students coming into our classrooms who get frustrated when they're learning languages and they really struggle and they seem unwilling or hesitant to try, those are our students with fixed mindsets who have probably been burned in the past. They're very academically focused. They worry more about the grade than the actual learning. And so if you can start getting your students to really embrace a growth mindset to where they're willing to put themselves out there and struggle and be more creative and see any errors that they make as learning experiences, because as language teachers, we've all had those moments. We've all been corrected by a native speaker. It could have been embarrassing. And we remember those that burn forever in our memories, but we've learned from them and we can laugh about them now. And our goal as teachers is really to get those students to be able to learn and grow from those experiences and be willing to laugh and struggle and enjoy it in the process, because the last thing we want is for our students to be miserable. So when we talk about performance, really when we want to design a performance activity, we want something where students are creating. and they're inventing something new. They're revealing who they are as learners, as individuals, and you can't do that unless you're willing to take risks. So when you push your students to have a growth mindset, that's where they're really going to start to feel success in the language for the first time.
Would any of you like to add to that from your perspectives?
Sure. Jessica mentioned this idea of valuing risk-taking, and I think building in that value of risk-taking as a routine, so that from the very beginning of a school year, getting students into that space where they see risk-taking as something that the entire classroom community values is really important, because that's where you really get your bang for the buck with growth mindset.
Okay. Meg, interestingly, you work with more adult learners. I wonder if you feel that this applies to us as teachers also.
I actually think that it applies to us more than anything, because if our students feel as though they're being judged on the basis of grades, that means that we're being judged on the basis of something equally fixed. I believe that a growth mindset is really based on relationship. In all the courses I teach, whether they're a 1-hour professional development or a 15-week graduate seminar, it starts with the relationship. And it's not just the relationship between you, the instructor, and the student. It's the whole relationship. If you don't feel connected to the others with whom you're learning, and I include the instructor in that, you can't grow. One of my favorite things about the pandemic approach to teaching is I've read a lot of things that say the first month should be about relationship. And you can do that in language amazingly. So,
Okay. Yeah. Mouna, did you have something you wanted to add in? Or?
I'm struck by everything that's been said, and it makes me think of another TEL domain, which is the learning environment, and how to make the learning environment safe for learning. A lot of what we're talking about when we talk about growth mindset is making students on some level comfortable with making mistakes, comfortable with failing even, and embracing that. And that's a tough lifelong lesson, whether you're in a language classroom or otherwise. So I think keeping that in mind is an important.
I think it was important maybe to start with this question, because it is that background piece for really moving to our next question, which is what are the benefits for teachers and learners when they actually have a better understanding of performance and proficiency? And maybe we have to connect that to growth mindset. Tim, I know you've done a ton of work with this.
Yeah, I think it's really important for teachers to be able to clearly name what the performance targets are for different levels, because you can't begin to define performance indicators for students or daily learning targets for students without understanding that here's what the work of a novice mid student or an intermediate student should look like. And so spending the time really digging into the performance levels and understanding them is, I think, the backbone of being able to do all of this work. You can't give feedback if you don't have that defined performance level for students, right? And if teachers cannot describe, here's what intermediate, mid, speaking, or interpersonal conversation should look like.
Okay. Meg, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that for us.
Oh my gosh, do I have thoughts? Just to start with, I'd like to suggest that rather than having one outcome, because we have so many heterogeneous classes, we should be looking at a range of outcomes. I really believe that it's about gain and growth for our students. Where did you start and where do you end and where did you want to go? I would not want to look for the same outcomes from a student who starts with more language. Let's say a student in the same class, I'm sure some of us have everyone from novice to intermediate mid in some of our classes. That novice mid who gets to novice high, that's huge. But that's a huge gain. But the intermediate mid who stays there or even goes back is a different animal. We need to look at all of our performances as gain rather than one set outcome. The other thing that I wrote down here was we need to have a good concept and a shared concept of what these performance and proficiency indicators are. So often we read it, but we don't understand what it sounds like or looks like, right? So that's what I really think is the benefit for teachers and learners, to understand, develop a shared understanding of what this means.
So possibly a segue question to that someone else would want to take, but how should we go about making our learners aware of this? I know that it will vary on their age and their level, but do you have suggestions or thoughts from your own practices of what teachers might be able to do to make these two concepts of proficiency and performance better understood?
Well, if I may,
Please.
One that I have worked with training teachers, and I have taught in the classroom as well. And one thing that I found very, very helpful is to adopt the can-do statements as far as learning intentions for our class, and referring to them often, going back to them often, creating this classroom conversation where the can-dos are at the center. And where, yes, we want to, the classroom will be taught, or the lesson will be taught in primarily the target language, but I do reserve and advocate for reserving a few minutes of time to just talk about, well, did we meet our learning intention? What do we need to get towards our learning intentions, or goals rather? So I think that that's one effective strategy that I work as well.
Other thoughts on that?
Clarity with the can-do statements, making sure students, if teachers have a goal, but the students don't know what that goal is, then it's really not a goal, right? Our can-do statements need to be a clear roadmap for students so that they know where they're going, where we'd like them to go. We often talk in our department about no secrets, no surprises teaching, right? We can't keep those. So we have to develop those kinds of lessons around what does proficiency development look like? What does leveling up your performance look like? So that, as Meg mentioned, no matter where you are in terms of what target's been set for a course, you know what your next steps can be to continue to improve your language skills.
Okay, and Jessica, from your perspective in your classrooms?
I think one of the most powerful tools that we have as educators is getting our students to reflect on things. So it's equally as important to create that roadmap with visual examples that are thoroughly broken down for students and making all of your expectations clear, but then also taking that time after they complete something to have them evaluate themselves with those learning targets, with proficiency language, to see where they think they are, what their strengths and weaknesses is, and where they want to go from there.
Can I add a little story here?
Of course.
I went to a back to school night many years ago when my son was, I think, in middle school, to his Spanish class. And the teacher talked to all of us parents. She did not know who I was or what I did for a living. We have different last names and so on. So she was doing this for everybody. And she talked a little bit about the syllabus, and then she played a sample of a student at the intermediate low level in Spanish and said, "This is what I expect of your kids by the end of the year." I was so happy, because instead of talk, it was, this is what we expected. Then she broke it down a little bit. And, my friends were all like, did you give her that? She did this all on her own. She was an amazing teacher. My son learned so much in that class. And I, of course, came home and played the same sample for him and said, this is what I expect from you by the end of the year. How are we doing this? Just kidding, kind of.
Well, I think that's, I'm glad you shared that story, Meg, because I think it makes it real and it gives teachers a strategy that they can use in setting reasonable goals. And then tying in with what you said earlier, if they're already there, then let me play one for you that sounds like what I expect of you, because I'm ready to push you a little bit more. And I think this year more than ever, our students are coming in at different levels, and it's going to be very important to remember that they're on this proficiency journey. They're not behind. There is no gap because of COVID. It is not on them it's on all teachers to just welcome them back and move them forward, just like you said. I believe it was you earlier, Megan. Megan, that's my daughter's name, as you know, Meg, so that's why I blew that name, so don't be offended. So let me take us back to one of the questions that came up in the morning sessions, and maybe you heard them or not, but I think there's a lot of confusion out there about what are characteristics of quality performance tasks. And I know that all of you are involved in this, so I'm just looking for that visual from one of you that says, this question is mine, Laura. What would you say if you had to explain to a teacher, you know, I can tell that you're giving quality performance tasks because this is what students are doing? We could start with what they're not doing. That's easier.
Well, I can jump in here. Performance tasks at their best are real world, but we use that term a lot, and then still teachers sometimes can say, well, what do you mean by that? If students are really interested and get excited about them, then we know we have a good performance task. If there's some cognitive challenge to them, so that we're not giving them something that's really too simplistic for them, right? I don't mean to suggest that we want to push them beyond their targeted level, but it needs to be cognitively challenging. It needs to be intrinsically interesting. We want kids to be hooked by it. And so we can actually ask kids for some ideas on interesting performance tasks and let them generate ideas on what they would like to do. Because I think there's a lot of power in letting kids help build what those tasks look like.
Okay. Other thoughts?
I would also say, from the feedback standpoint, what are your students understanding from your feedback? What do they hear or see or read versus what do you say? And I think this goes from everybody from the littles all the way up through us as teachers getting feedback on our performance. When you get your performance appraisal, do you look at the 87 things you're doing well or the one criticism you got? So it's
the one criticism.
Right. So it's important to look at it and say, this isn't a criticism. We're all growing. This is something that I want you to work on. And to share with them, these are things I've been working on my whole life. Like, I don't know, my daughter would say pushing my chair in after dinner is something that I'm going to be working on for a long time. Or maybe for her, cleaning off the counter appropriately.
Other thoughts about performance tasks? Jessica, what do you think? Giving your careful attention to designing for success and growth mindset, or is there some things that you try to keep in mind when you're designing these tasks?
Absolutely. I think my biggest thing is I don't want any activity that I give to be able that students complete by either regurgitating or just replicating things that I've already given them. I never tie them down to using specific grammar or specific vocab because I want them to use language that is meaningful to them. So when we talk about doing any sort of performance task in my class, I'm giving them a generalized concept of what I'm wanting them to accomplish, and I want them to develop the strategies and steps that they want to take. And we have to build up to this, obviously, but I give them just a very skeleton structure of what I want, and I let them take the full reins and the autonomy to decide how they want to get there.
Yeah. Ideally, we would have performance tasks that mirror our performance learning goals or objectives. And if I might even take it a step further, yes, we want to see that students are able to do or use the language in the manner that was planned out, but also give us an indicator of what they could potentially be capable of doing next. So how they could transfer what they have to similar situations, similar exchanges, similar communicative performance tasks, but that might be at a slightly higher level.
I think those are all really good ideas. We have a really tough question that just came in from our audience. So let me kind of give you this in a synopsis. Our audience is wondering how you actually grade for performance. And I think this is going to tie into the rubrics question that we had thought we might get. But how do we grade for performance versus this notion of content and accuracy? And then I find the last tagline of this question to be really interesting because parents are mainly focused on grades. So I think the question is asking us to think about grading for performance versus grading for right and wrong. And then I think we have to explore this notion of what parents want or think they want. So has anybody felt like they've addressed this? I think we have to look to Tim or Jessica because this is clearly probably from a middle school, high school perspective. What would you say? What are you all doing to convey to parents, first of all, what a grade means, and then possibly to grade for performance and not for accuracy? Tim, you're nodding the most.
Sure, I am, but I was also thinking, having seen Jessica's presentation, she has a lot to say about this that I think
we will definitely give you the time you need. This is a big question.
So this ties into one of the questions that was one of our prepared questions around rubrics. I think it's really important that Jessica mentioned student reflection before. The rubric that I think has to be developed by the teachers, that it has to be seen as a tool for teachers and a tool for students. And so then you can describe what success looks like, and you can describe that to parents as well. And so that bring the parents into that conversation of here's what teaching for proficiency looks like, and here's what success looks like in this particular class. And so I think when you get that kind of dialogue between the community and the teachers, then you get some more buy-in when they can understand why things might look different than when they took a language and they did a lot of grammar tests and fill in the blank worksheets.
Mm-hmm. So you think some of that is legacy practice that has stuck in parents' mind, and it's up to us to educate them.
Yeah, and I think we've had a lot of conversation in our program around, because we still are married to this ABCD world of grade giving, even though I would prefer not to be there, but we are. And so we've said, okay, when performance meets a target, that's B work, because we do so much work with our kids on reflection. And as Stephanie Carboneau from York, Maine talks about glow and grow feedback, that every kid knows what they can do in order to earn an A if they're really motivated by grades. And so they know what that looks like. They know what B work looks like. They know what A work looks like. They get a ton of feedback on how to level up. And so when that really becomes established and it's well articulated across grade levels, and whether your program is K to 12 or 9 to 12, that when you have full program buy-in, then parents understand what that looks like. It's not something that's changing from teacher to teacher.
Jessica, is there something you want to add to that from your perspective? Please.
So the biggest thing that I tell my students and my parents is that I do not ever expect them to be perfect from the beginning. We are going to make mistakes. That's expected that we're going to make mistakes, and I'm not going to penalize them for making those mistakes. So when I'm rating my students, I'm using a performance rubric, and the only grade they ever receive from me is a proficiency rating. And they never see a 0 to 100 the entire year until that final report card. And so when they say, well, where do I need to finish? I say, you need to finish at intermediate mid by the end of the semester. Right now, you're intermediate low. What do you notice in this rubric between intermediate low and intermediate mid that you need to change in your work in order to reach that goal? And so when parents come to me, they struggle with this the most. The kids get it. The parents, they struggle. I just tell them, this is a sample of your student's last assignment. These are the types of structures I'm seeing. So this is the type of proficiency they have. If they want to meet the next level, these are the types of things they're going to have to really build and develop. And so when you give them those specific targeted things like they need to be using more than one tense. They need to be doing this. They need to be doing that. The parents kind of, they see a pathway. It's a little bit more simplified than, they need to get 2 points higher to get that A. It's they need to do X, Y, Z. So these are the strategies that the student can use to get there. And it starts to make a lot more sense to parents. So if you're willing to take that time and really push everyone to accept full proficiency rating, it is a huge win for everyone.
Mouna, you want to add something?
So I hear what Jessica's saying. The thing is, speaking as a parent of a child who's learning Spanish right now, I really want to know how my child is doing. And to a lot of parents, the only way we think we know how our child is doing is by looking at grades. The minute that you debunk the idea that that's the only information that counts or matters, then I'm more interested in hearing about the different kinds of, criteria for success. And that goes back to understanding rubrics. I'm perfectly happy looking at a rubric. Maybe that's because I'm a little bit of a geek, but I don't think that it is, I really appreciate it when the teacher spells out what is the child learning, where is the child struggling, where is the child supposed to be going. And I've worked with teachers and who have been developing their understanding of formative assessment. And many of them say, well, this makes sense to me. This makes sense to my students. We've established a culture in our classroom where this is, the way we understand learning and progress and advances and proficiency. But how do I translate that to my parents? And it's really about translating it and educating the parents as you go along.
So those open communication with parents at the beginning of the year that explains what it is we're trying to accomplish right now. I'm going to move on because the next question from our audience, I think, dovetails with this one. And basically what they're asking is, would anyone feel comfortable giving an example of a novice task? The caveat to that is most times students at this level are not really able to produce totally authentic language. So perhaps what would the task look like? And then I know from my perspective, I'm always, when I write a task, trying to imagine, as my colleague Donna Clementi says, what the student work that would make my heart sing would look like. So if you're thinking about that, do you have a thought in mind? Who's got those lowest level learners, novice, or has familiarity with them that could throw in a task sample they might be using at the beginning of the year? Jessica?
Sure.
You look like you're ready.
So when we think about tasks, you can give any authentic stimulus, and just the task level is going to be broken down by what you're asking them to do with it. So for example, if you're studying the weather, a novice task would just be saying it's sunny, it's rainy, I want to play whatever, or I like to play soccer when it's raining. That would be more novice high. But then you can even take that same task and push it into the intermediate level of when it's sunny, I like to do this because, and you're adding more detail. And so really it's just giving them an opportunity. Any task can be novice. The hard part is getting them into that intermediate advance. So just giving them opportunities to give, because with novice, to me, I think memorized expression. We have tons of memorized expressions.
Meg, you want to chime in there?
I would say the challenge of novice is giving good feedback to students or learners to help them understand that they accomplished what you asked them to do at that level. I just want all of you to think of the first time you produced or recognized or did something in a new language you were learning, and how amazing it was that your point got across or that you understood the point, even if it was like 3 words, right? That's what a novice task, I think, should be. It should be clear what you're asking, and it should be clear that you get feedback. Yeah, you did it. And I'm especially thinking that first month of the year when you have those students who may have never heard or seen this language before, and they are excited. And by excited, I mean terrified.
Tim?
So I have an example. Several of my middle school teachers use this kind of task with pet adoption and pet rescue websites from various countries, where they ask kids, they give kids a scenario and say, look at these pets, right? These are real pet adoption sites, and which one is the right fit for this particular family situation. So they have to engage with this authentic text, this website from a target culture, but the language they're producing, right? They have sophisticated ideas around why this dog or cat or other pet might or might not be a match for this particular scenario. So their thinking is sophisticated, but the language that they're producing is very simple, right? And we can give them sentence frames, and we can give them lots of scaffolds and supports that we eventually want to start pulling away. Greta Lundgaard refers to them as the be sure tos, right? We can start out with the be sure to, but we want to pull those away so that there's less and less support. But that kind of a task can be a novice task. And then, as Jessica mentioned, that same task, which pet is appropriate, can be done at intermediate or advanced levels as well.
Also, I'm not supposed to chime in as the moderator, but I must. I also think that it's really important to remember that novice level is memorized language, and we're the ones that are selecting the chunks of language that they will memorize. So there is no reason to start with simplified language. The example that came out in the discussion yesterday on planning was you could teach a child right now, especially in these times of COVID, to start out by saying, I'm an extrovert and I like to, because there's so much discussion about did introverts or extroverts do better when we had stay-at-home orders. And I think that we need to recognize that just because they are beginning language in middle or high school, cognitively, some of the traditional language we've taught at novice level, it doesn't lend itself to a novice task that they'll want to engage in. But that pet adoption is a perfect example. You're going to teach sentence frames. This dog is perfect for this family because they like to walk. And this dog likes to walk. But cognitively, this is engaging. And I think that's what we have to remember. So it is authentic language, and that it is based on that authentic text. Did anybody want to add in anything about those tasks? Because if not, I'm going to turn us a bit to feedback. So we had a question about protocols and rubrics and how they would be used to inform feedback. And I wonder if you just want to focus in on that particular question for a minute, because I know there's a lot of different rubrics out there and many opinions about how they should be used, but maybe more than favoring something over another, what are good qualities of these rubrics that we use so that they truly inform performance?
If I can jump in, to quote Dylan Williams, who I'm, the foremost experts on feedback and formative assessment, it's if feedback is not helping you form learning in some way, if it's not helping you think about next steps, next decisions, instructionally or learning-wise, that's a clue that maybe the rubric is not as effective as it needs to be. I've seen teachers develop rubrics that are extremely general and holistic and broad, and it could work in certain situations. And then I've seen teachers who will spell out every last detail that needs to be in the performance task. And neither one of those is terribly helpful, because if they're just, giving you what you expect, then what does that really mean? I mean, are they really able to function as independent users of the language or not? But so the key thing with regards to protocols or rubrics, a really good, effective rubric is something that helps the student think about what they need to do next.
Go ahead, Meg.
So I have a list. I did not make a rubric of what a rubric should be, although perhaps I will for my next adventure. One of the first things is that they should make sense. And as Mouna said, articulate from one level to another. What do I do next? What do I need to do to get there? The next should be that students understand them, and they shouldn't be full of jargon. And I know we always say this, but I sometimes give my rubrics for my classes to other people and say, do you understand what you need to do here? And I think that's super helpful. Do they reflect the task? I think sometimes we take a general rubric and we just paste it on to a specific task. So making your task specific, making your rubric specific enough for the task. So you might say to a student, yeah, you did this well on this last task. What do you need to do on this thing? For a class, I like to say, are they narrow enough to show gain and broad enough to show that they map onto something bigger, like the goals for the course? How do you hit that? As Jessica would say, you need to get to intermediate mid. Right now you're here. What's the next thing you need to do? And I always tell my students to rate themselves. I think it's fun. I think you can eventually do it in the target language. And I think it provides a lot of reflection. That's
others that want to chime in.
Yeah. What Meg says about having this sort of big picture and then being able to narrow it down so that it's always about what's the next step, I think is the key to a good rubric. We found that it was really important for teachers in the program to develop a global rubric for the program, but then to be able to break it down so that each level, each task has those specific can-do statements built in to the appropriate level so that students are working with that and able to get that level up information and do that reflection. Susan Brookhart talks about how much feedback is just the right amount. And, you know, she lands on this idea of 2 to 3 pieces of feedback, which really is different from what we see lots and lots of teachers do with how much feedback they give kids. And so we've tried practicing giving just 2 to 3 pieces of specific, descriptive, actionable feedback to kids on their work so that they can really then do something with that feedback. Because if they're not doing something with feedback, then the feedback is not worth our time and it's not worth their time.
Mm-hmm. Jessica, do you have something you want to add from your perspective?
I think it's also very important to always make sure any task is going to be recycling old information that you've already covered, because the second you stop revisiting it and reincorporating it, the kids are going to lose it and think that it's no longer important. So by creating and designing these activities that are going to pull those back into it, they remember that these are important skills that can help me reach the proficiency that I want, and I value this and I need to continue to use it.
Okay. Well, I think the final question we had for the panelists is probably one that we need to focus on for a few minutes, and that is, what are effective tools for giving feedback? And I think that especially in this days of not knowing what we're going to be doing or how we're going to be doing it, did any of you discover tools that are efficient for giving feedback? Did you find ways that worked for students and then maybe also parents as you're communicating a message? And is there anything that can make it easier for a teacher who has 180 students, shall we say, and is trying to do the best they can to give this feedback for learning? Because we have to be realistic, right? Let's go to 2 of our practicing teachers. What keeps you sane in this whole process? Any thoughts? What are you doing? Did you find any tools you were using in the spring? Anything that would help our teachers?
I do, but I didn't want to jump in on top of Jessica. I didn't want to be a... But
be okay.
I think there are a lot of things that we can do online. If you have Google Classroom, there are a lot of different tools in Google Classroom that can facilitate feedback. You know, this idea of Bitmojis, I think it was Meredith White, who, if you check her out on Twitter, has lots of ideas, and she created this preset feedback with Bitmojis, which is really a fun way so that when it's appropriate, she can cut and paste a really fun Bitmoji of herself with some feedback that's either, you know, process specific or self-regulation specific or even task specific feedback for kids. So having this sort of like this collection of preset feedback can save you a lot of time. And when you do it with Bitmojis, it can be fun for kids to see their teacher, and there's one with, the teacher inside a big Jell-O mold saying, "I'm stuck," right?
Okay, that's worth looking up. Other thoughts on tools or tips that you found in the spring for giving feedback?
One of the things that I started doing that I really thought gave my students a lot of good benefits is I was giving audio feedback, especially because when we went virtual, we kind of lost that personal connection. And when you just send feedback electronically, they may not even look at it. But if you actually send a video of you going over their work, you're not only giving them feedback, but then they can pause and really think and see exactly what you're targeting when you're giving that feedback. You can highlight specific examples. I use Screencastify because the free version cuts you off at 5 minutes, so you're not giving too much feedback. And two, the tone of your voice is going to convey so much information more than just written words. And so you might say, hey, you really need to work on this. And they can tell by the tone of your voice, it's like, okay, now you're pushing the limits of how many times I want to see this mistake, or you did this so incredibly well, and they can hear that excitement in your voice. That's going to be so much more meaningful than just something written.
That's great. Well, I'm going to cut this one a little bit because we have one more question from the audience. I know you love these questions that just pop in, but they are asking, how would you suggest continuing performance-based in a virtual classroom? And a segue to that is, how do you really promote the student-to-student conversation? That piece of performance, I think many are looking for guidance on. So I know that a couple of you have taught online and have depths of experience, but how do we continue performance-based virtually? How did you do that last spring? And then if you have any tips you can share on promoting the student-to-student interaction in the interpersonal mode?
I know that, sorry.
Please, Jessica, go ahead.
So the way I did virtual learning is that any of my front loading of material I would do asynchronously, so that I would record a presentation, my students would watch it on their own time, then I would have office hours for questions. But anytime I wanted to target performance-based, in particular the interpersonal mode, I would schedule individual little small groups of about 5 students at a time, and I would give tasks and guide the conversation and have the students lead what we would talk about for that day. And it would be impossible with large groups, really, but just the interaction there of getting that spontaneous language, because there's no way to prep because I didn't tell them what we would be talking about that day. We had really good, authentic language, even in the limited environment that we had.
Mouna, you wanted to jump in also on that one?
There was, I worked with undergraduate students at one point, and I had them schedule not just conversation chats I would have to do online with one another, actually through Skype. And then, but I would also have them at the end of the conversation reflect on what they felt frustrated about, what they couldn't really express very well, even though, they've had an opportunity to practice or learn it in rehearse it in class, and what things went easily, and give each other very candid feedback about what they felt was needed.
Okay. And
then share out with me whenever we got together. So making it more of a conversation rather than an ongoing conversation, excuse me. And so that I found was very helpful.
And Tim, you were probably dealing with the larger groups of students, and so we want to hear that.
Yeah, we found it really helpful to provide resources up front and let kids know, so here's a resource that you can use while you're doing your task tomorrow, right? So if you're doing Zoom breakout rooms, providing some resources like sentence frames or pictures, or Amy Leonard has this great, I forget what she calls it, but this great tool for, fractions. Yes, thank you very much, right? So this great tool for where students can refer and help their conversation, their conversational language. Give them a task, so that if you're putting students in breakout rooms, and right now Zoom does not have a way to for a teacher to monitor all the breakout rooms at once, but give them a task with some accountability, and they have to do some kind of reporting out afterwards. That really has helped students stay on task and not, because it's really easy for students, and we do this as adults too, we get into the breakout room and then we forget what the instructions were, right? So if they have a task to complete and some accountability and some of those scaffolds and resources, then we have better chance of them really engaging with the target language.
Okay, please, Meg.
One pro tip, I was in some Zoom session doing some Zoom thing with some Zoom group, and the instructions were put in the chat after we went into our Zoom room so that we could refer to them, which is, I was so embarrassed that I'd never thought of that. But it was so easy because instead of spending, I mean, whenever you put kids in groups or anyone in a group, you spend the first 5 minutes saying, what are we supposed to be doing? Were you listening? I don't know. You put it in the chat and you actually save a lot of time.
Mm-hmm. Mouna, I think you wanted to chime in there. You were smiling when she was saying that.
Just, it resonated. It was very similar.
Well, and the one that I picked up from someone with all of these that we've been doing is tell them to take a picture of your slide before they go in to the rooms, and then that way they have everything, the pictures, the images, the sentence frames, whatever they need. So I think this is all just, we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves, right? This is a huge learning curve for everyone going into these virtual environments. Do you have any closing thoughts that you want to share on performance and feedback from your perspective, and what you're thinking about maybe for how you're going to start this year? You know, those priorities that you're placing on what may be a very different year for all of us. Be careful, the person who nods the most gets the first question, Tim. It may be behavioral on your part, but
I have this nodding habit.
Well, we're in that culture, right? Nodding is affirmation. So it's all yours, Tim.
We have agreed that we need to look at our curriculum and decide what's really important and what's not important. And start the year out with a strong focus on social emotional learning, but make sure also that we're folding in these social emotional learning routines into everything that we do, right? And so you see this huge overlap with social emotional learning and research in cognitive psychology and the literature on feedback, and there's so much overlap in those three areas. So it's really important to slow it down, build in time so that you're building in time for feedback, for students to do something with the feedback. It means you're maybe getting through less content, but the content is more meaningful and more valid for students long term.
Great points. Meg, do you have some final words for us?
One thing I really want to focus on is relationship. One thing I do in my classes, and again, I teach linguistics, is I do a weekly survey of my students to find out. Laura's probably going to laugh because she knows I love surveys. And I do, presentations where I suggest how you can use that in language. Just how much time did you spend on this? How are you feeling? I'm going to be teaching hybrid. I'm sure it's going to be really challenging. And I'm just going to say very vulnerably to my students, I have never done this before. We have never done this before. Let's keep track of what's working. And I think that's really hard to let yourself as an instructor say, I am still figuring this out.
And it was very interesting, if someone in our audience did not watch the middle school student panelist yesterday, that is now recorded and up. And that was very insightful from what the students wanted. So it was sort of like a student survey to all of us. Mouna, what would you be thinking of for the next?
Be thinking of somewhat tied into what Tim was saying about the social emotional aspect, is that really good feedback should engage students on a more, their thoughts rather than as much their emotions. And by that, I mean, not that they are not, pleased with what they hear or concerned about what they need to do next, but that it doesn't affect them to the point that they feel like, I can't do this, or I can't, or that it serves some kind of a block, that there's some thing about the feedback that is very conscientious, that you're telling students and having conversations often with students that what we're doing actually here is we're processing information about what we're learning and making it that explicit. You know, I'm processing information about how you're learning and so are you, and we're doing this together. I think that cannot be stated enough. And
maybe it's that the social emotional components have to be there because you can't cognitively process if you're not in a good place. And so that's going to be two things to keep in mind. Jessica, you get our final parting words.
I still don't even know what to think about this year, but I think the biggest thing ever for me this coming year is that I need to be open to feedback just as much as my students need to be open to feedback, and be clear and model that I'm still growing as a person. I'm still figuring this out, and it's okay if I don't get it right the first time. We're all going to make mistakes, and you know, like Meg was saying, be willing to get feedback from students. Ask them directly, what did this work for you? What would work better for you? And be willing to be adapted to their needs and really make it a two-way street of getting this done.
Great closing thoughts. Well, I want to extend sincere thanks to our panelists who gave up time to prepare for this and to share your thinking with us. And I can tell from the comments that have been flying across my screen that we've gotten quite a bit of participation in the chat feature box also. And I want to remind those that are listening to us that if your questions were posted and did not get answered, you can go back to the Google Docs for all of the individual sessions. There are presenters here with us now, and presenters may be monitoring those, but also questions that get posted can be answered by others in our world language community. So I hope that everyone that is listening and our panelists enjoy more features of this conversation, and we will continue forward. And I wish all of you the best for your new school year. Thank you again.
Thank you, Laura.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Laura.
Bye.